I'm Kari Borne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services, and we've been doing this since 1983. And every year that we have every 4 years, we have a presidential election, and so we focus on the election, and we offer a variety of topics related to the election. Today's will be really good because it's really, it's local, right? So that's awesome. Today's presenter is Jonah Ralston. He's an associate professor in the Department of Politics, Government, and Law at UW-Whitewater, and he's the chair of the university's Faculty Senate. Prior to his current academic appointment, he was employed as a program analyst for a nonpartisan legislative service agency in the state of Wisconsin, and before beginning his doctoral studies, he had spent 3 years working as a business analyst with the Boeing Company. His academic credentials include a PhD from Michigan State University in political science, a master's degree in international affairs from Washington University in St. Louis, and a bachelor's degree in economics and finance from Illinois State University. He currently lives with his wife and 2 children in Fort Atkinson. Please welcome Dr. Jonah Ralston.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out for this lecture today. We'll be talking about redistricting and talking about the new maps in the state of Wisconsin and what that's likely to mean for the outcome at the state level. So you're probably all geared up for the presidential election that's coming up, but there's been a massive political shift at the state level, and that will really change the representation in our state legislature. So I kind of want to talk about that today. And thank you, Kari, for that nice introduction. I probably should shorten that, right? It's too long. I'm really not that impressive. All right, but we'll go ahead and get started here. Redistricting, what is it? So as you might be aware, right, it's just drawing those boundaries that determine how a legislator is representing people and territory. And that's done at the state level, and it's also done at the federal level. It's done after every census, but it can be done in between. The federal level, this is required because the states have populations that change, right? And the number of state or the districts for states, right, the House of Representatives, has been set at 435 for some time now. And so when we have population shifts, like if Texas is growing and say a Midwestern state is not, we have to reapportion those seats. And so some states can lose seats, others can gain them. Well, obviously, if that happens, you're going to have to redraw your maps, right? So naturally, at the federal level, you're going to have to redraw your maps every 10 years because of this process. And that's laid out right there in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. And, of course, every state gets at least one representative in the House of Representatives. So even if they don't have enough that would technically qualify, like a place like Wyoming, say, they're still going to get an at-large district. There's also some really important Supreme Court decisions that have been made, particularly in the 1960s, related to one person, one vote. And what that means is that every House district should represent the same number of people. And in state districts, they've also applied this through, again, those series of cases in the 1960s to the state level. So state districts should also be of pretty equal proportion. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to senators because every state has 2 senators, right? So in that case, one person, one vote doesn't apply because somebody voting for their senator in California has a lot less power, right, in casting that vote compared to somebody casting their vote, say, in Delaware, right, for their senator. Because each of those states gets 2 despite the large disparity in their populations. But otherwise, this applies. So if it's a state level or a federal level besides Senate, this rule applies. And generally, they want the House districts to be very close in proportion. And so we're talking less than 1% in deviation. So every district in Wisconsin, and we have 8 of these House districts for the federal level, right? 8 of those congressional House of Representatives districts is about 760,000 people. which is quite a few when you think about it, right? One person representing 760,000 people, but of course that becomes much more of a disparity when you think of a state like Texas or New York, where they're representing millions, right? And generally for state legislative districts, they do allow more variation. So they still want them to be somewhat proportional, but they will allow more variation, up to 10% usually deviation. Now, why did they do this? Well, in the 1960s, what happened is somebody brought a lawsuit because in Los Angeles County, they were getting one representative, and so was the smallest district in California. And the disparity between those two districts, Los Angeles County had 422 times more people than the other district. And so they brought the argument that this wasn't fair, right? That their vote counted for far less, right? And there was agreement at the Supreme Court that that actually was unfair. Their votes should be equal, right? Should be similar. And now this process is done every 10 years, right? Where they don't just do the federal level races now, right? They're doing the state level as well. And why are states doing this? Because they are tasked with this responsibility from the Constitution. So if you look at the language, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, states are responsible for this. Now, it does say in particular state legislatures, but the Supreme Court in 2015 said that, well, really that word is saying the power that makes laws. So if a state legislature wants to pass a bill that creates a commission that does this work on behalf of the state, right, that's acceptable. And so that's why some states actually don't go through their legislature. They actually have independent commissions that do this work. Now, in Wisconsin, we go through the legislature, okay, and that's what most states do. So more than half of the states do this. And in Wisconsin, that's in our Constitution, so the state Constitution, Article 4, Section 3. And it just follows the standard legislative process, where the legislator draws these lines. And nowadays, of course, this is a very sophisticated process where they actually hire firms who use a lot of information about every single person in a district, right? And they try to draw these maps for partisan advantage, of course, right? Naturally. And those maps then are voted on in the Assembly, voted on in the state Senate, and then they go to the governor. And then the governor can either approve them or veto them. If they can't agree, then the courts will get involved. And that's happened many times, and I'll explain that as we go further along here. But in our state legislature, we have 99 assembly seats, and we have 33 state senate seats. At the federal level, we have 8 House districts, and then, of course, like every other state, we have 2 senators. Now, other states, there's a lot of variation. So you could see here that there's a large swath of states that do this through the legislature. And that process looks very similar to Wisconsin. Most of those are, in fact, held by Republicans right now, most of the states that do it that way. If you look at the West, where the initiative process is more common, where citizens get to vote on their own policies, right? Whether those are state constitutional amendments or actual laws. Those states have tended to use a commission. And that's because, again, where the initiative process is used, most people, if you look at surveys on this, would prefer it to not be done by politicians, right? Okay, for obvious reasons, right? And you could see that in Wisconsin right now we have split control between the governor's office and the legislature, but I'll talk about how that balance may shift, right, in the next few election cycles based on the new maps we have. And then you could see there's, again, I don't want to go into too much detail on some of these other variations here. Now, you notice some states, this is just looking at how they redistrict House districts for the House of Representatives. Most use the same process for the House and their state level maps. Some actually have distinction between that. So there's huge variation in this. But you notice the 3 that are, there's actually more than 3. There's a few that don't have anything showing up there, and that's because they have one House district, right? So there's no redistricting, right? Okay, so what do they take into account when they do this process? So one thing that they take into account is the equal population. That's a requirement. Remember, this comes from the Supreme Court. They have to abide by that. They just have no choice, right? Compactness and contiguity. So that just means that the districts have to be whole, right? They can't just have huge chunks from over here and over there, right? They actually have to be one district. And they should try to follow a standard shape. Now, this doesn't always happen, but, right, they're supposed to follow a more standard shape. There's also the communities of interest. So, you think about impacts on municipalities, right? You wouldn't want to split down the middle of a town, per se, right? You'd probably want to keep the town together. You might want to think about how you balance counties, right? And maybe not splitting big chunks of one county into several different districts, right? Trying to keep them together. And there's also considerations of the different groups within those districts. And federal law, in fact, requires that under certain circumstances, you actually have to provide some minority-majority districts, meaning if you have different ethnic groups, different minorities, that they should also be able to choose their representative, right? So you might create a district that has an actual over 50% of that is a minority population, right? So they get to choose a representative. And we have some of those in Wisconsin. I think it's about 5 state-level ones for African Americans and about 2 for Latinos. Obviously, I didn't mention partisanship. That's because it's not really a requirement, but obviously, when you have politicians drawing the maps, they're going to draw them for political advantage, right? Now, in Wisconsin, this is a rather cluttered slide, but this is actually a brief history of redistricting in Wisconsin, recent redistricting. So in 1982, 92, and 2002, the legislature and the governor could not agree, and those maps were all drawn by district judges, federal district judges. And so those maps were fairly balanced in terms of partisanship because the judges were not looking at it for partisan gain, right? Partisan advantage. They were just simply drawing the maps based on some of those considerations I gave you in the previous slide. But when Republicans took control in 2011, they had unified control at the governor, right, and the Assembly and State Senate. So they drew maps that heavily favored their party, which again is what you would expect, right? It's what Illinois has been doing for many election cycles, right? I mean, they just draw them for Democrats, whereas in this case it was for Republicans, right? And so these maps were challenged because they gave such an advantage to the Republicans. This was one of the more sophisticated map-making exercises. So they actually used some law firms. Those folks were using like GIS data, and again, a treasure trove of data, personal data on people, right, to gauge their partisanship, and then they would try to move those district lines in such a way that it would advantage their party, right, to get those voters. So basically what you had is politicians picking who they were going to represent instead of the people choosing who would represent them, right? I mean, there's just really no other way to say that. That's basically how those maps were designed. So that's why they were challenged, and that challenge actually made its way all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which decided not to intervene. And why there was a potential that there was going to be intervention is that this was the previous court with Kennedy as the swing vote, if you recall that a few years back. And some people had thought that maybe Kennedy would be interested in intervening, and that would be enough to get a 5-4 majority, but that didn't happen. In the last round of redistricting, so that was again 2011. Now we're going back to 2021. So a more recent redistricting. We had a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. So what you would have expected is what happened in 1982, 1992, 2002, right? Where because they couldn't agree, that would end up with some federal judges who would draw those maps. You have to, I'm sure, recognize that politics have changed a bit since 1982, 92, and 2002. Things are a bit more extreme, right? And so when one party's in control, they tend to take more extreme measures than they maybe would have in the past, right? And so in this case, we had, at the time, a Wisconsin Supreme Court was dominated by conservatives, and they were an activist court, so they decided to intervene, which hadn't been done previously. As the state Supreme Court, they intervened, and they created a least changes rule, which again really had never been done before. There's really no precedent for it. And basically what it says is you have to create a new map that looks like the old map. Well, it's pretty obvious why they did that, right? It heavily advantages the Republicans, right? So it basically baked in the Republican advantage and gerrymander into the next round of maps. So, as you might have guessed, because of the state of politics these days, as soon as the control of that court flipped to liberal control, the maps were challenged and thrown out, right? And so in 2023 in December, those maps were thrown out. And it was a 4-3 majority because, again, the liberals had the majority at this point, right? So it was along clear partisan lines. And they rejected this least changes approach, which, again, really did not have a precedent. But what they actually ruled on, and this was surprising to some folks, is they actually ruled these state maps had to be thrown out because they weren't contiguous. And it is true. There were a number of districts that had little pockets that were outside of the district, right? So they weren't actually one whole district. So they used a very technical argument to actually throw these maps out. And so it was actually quite smart from a jurisprudential perspective, right? Because it would be hard to challenge that then, right? Because the Constitution requires contiguity in the districts. Now, they did keep the House districts. And we have very heavily gerrymandered House of Representatives districts. So we're about a 50-50 state, right? Very purple, I'm sure, as you well know, with the current presidential election about to happen. But typically, Republicans win 5 out of 8 of those House districts, even though partisan balance is pretty balanced, right? So Republicans, in response to these maps being thrown out, actually had proposed maybe we should just do an independent type commission strategy, right? Like what Iowa does. And Democrats had previously proposed that. But there were some problems with that because it would bake in the maps until the next census, right? So that would be a pretty long period. And also there were concerns about provision that had been added that if the legislature didn't like the maps after a couple of rounds of this map making, they could just reject them and draw their own. So to a lot of people, it seemed like, well, this is a way to kind of a backdoor gerrymandering again, right? And so that was rejected. And then eventually they accepted what Evers had proposed for state maps. And I'll show you why. And those were passed and approved for the state assembly and the state senate. Okay, so first I'll give you some hypotheticals, and then I'll show you the actual proposals that the state Supreme Court was considering before the legislature decided to accept Evers maps. And I'll show you why they accepted Evers maps, because it seems strange given the current politics of the state where they can't seem to agree on anything, right? The legislature and the governor, why they would actually agree to the same set of maps, and I'll show you why. But let's go over some hypotheticals, and this is really going to show you how the method of drawing the map matters, right? And you could come up with so many different outcomes based on what your objective is, right? And so it'll make sense as we go along. So let's assume that we've got these congressional districts we need to draw. So we're going to do it for the House level. It's a little easier to do that because there's fewer of them. And let's say we have to draw districts that have about 600,000 people. Let's say we like to draw them by county. So again, I'm simplifying things here for you. And let's say we have these voting patterns where it's a pretty evenly balanced state, although it slightly favors Republicans. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through these examples. Okay, so let's say we have a very boring square state like, I don't know, Iowa. Okay, it is like that though, right? Yeah, I know, sorry for anybody from Iowa, right? But it's just your border, that's all I'm saying. Your state is great. But the border, right, is just a square. There's a lot of these square states out there, right, that were just drawn as squares. So let's say we have a square state. And let's say that we have this kind of composition for the voters in this state. And let's say Democrats are in control. So let's say Democrats control the legislature and the governorship, and your goal will be to maximize the power of Democratic gains, right? So this would be like what Illinois has usually done, right? So they've usually been a partisan gerrymander, but it's favored the Democrats. So looking at this, there are some ways to do it. And this is just one possibility. You could easily get 3 Democratic districts, 1 competitive district, and put 2 solid Republican districts. So what you typically try to do is create very solidly partisan districts for the other party, like meaning their votes are really unnecessary in terms of how many votes are, it could be 60+%, right, or so going for that one party. And so they're going to be very partisan districts. But what that does is allow you to create safer districts for yourself, maybe 1 competitive district, and then maybe a solidly partisan district for yourself. So you can get, in this example, 2 Republican districts, 3 Democratic ones, and 1 that's competitive for your party. So in a sense, you could end up with 4 for your party, right, and 2 for the other. Now let's flip it, right, and say it's the Republicans. Would they be able to do the same thing? And of course, the answer is, yeah, of course, right? They would also be able to do the same type of partisan gerrymander, where they could create an advantage for Republicans. And so if we take a look at this, it looks, you could do it, you could draw it like this. So we pack all those Democrats into what is probably a big city up in that corner, right? Pack them all into that city, and then we maybe pack one around the surrounding area there that's below it, and now we create a competitive district next to it, and then we use the advantage of how the Republicans tend to be more out into rural areas, right? So we combine some of those rural areas in a way that creates an advantage for Republicans. And so Republicans do tend to have, because of the urban-rural divide in the state of Wisconsin, they do tend to have a slight advantage when it comes to redistricting. It's actually easier to kind of move those large blocks of rural voters around, right, than it is the very concentrated, dense urban voters, right, that tend to be very Democratic. And so that does create a natural slight advantage for Republicans in our state, for example. So for them, it's fairly easy to set up something like this. Now, let's say we were under some of those previous arrangements in Wisconsin where you had the divided government of the past, where they would actually work together to try to find a solution. I know those bygone days, right, of bipartisanship. But let's say that we're back in those days and that they've decided they actually are going to try to cooperate with each other and develop a map. What you could do if you wanted safe seats for each of your party is do something like this. So what you've done is create actually 6 solidly partisan districts. 3 just happen to be for Democrats. 3 happen to be from Republicans, right? And so just in these examples, I've shown you how you can get very different outcomes, right, depending on what your objective is. And if we take a look here, what we've done is create mostly rural Republican districts and then more urban suburban Democratic districts, right? So we've used that kind of urban-rural divide and used it to our advantage to separate out the partisan nature of those districts. Now, you may want competitive districts, right? You may argue that maybe we need to have districts where you have candidates having to compete for their votes, right, of the people. Now, that might be more of like what an independent commission might do. Because in the model of an independent commission, usually how that works is you might have some partisans on that commission, which are going to be balanced, and then you have some folks that are independent, right, or nonpartisan. And so they may actually want a map that will maximize those competitive districts, and that would look something maybe like this, right? So we create a solidly safe Republican district, a solidly safe Democratic district, one that leans Democratic, one that leans Republican, and then we have 2 very competitive districts that are evenly balanced. And so, again, just to show you these variations, so this is 2, 2, and 2, 3 and 3, and then you have 4, possibly, and 2, and 4 possibly, and 2, right? And that's just a very simplified example, but you can imagine with sophisticated technology available and the data that people have today, how you could design these districts, right? To get the optimal outcome for your party, or if it's not your party, maybe just in terms of keeping communities together, if it was an independent commission or, a legislative service agency or something like that. Okay, so there was a map maker, David Winston, who drew the House seats for the 1990 census, after that census, and he summed it up best. He said, as a map maker, I can have more of an impact on an election than a campaign, than a candidate. When I, as a map maker, have more of an impact on an election than the voters, the system is out of whack. Okay. And this was in 1990. Okay, now imagine what types of information they have available on each of you, right? Do any of you use Google, right? You're leaving a trail of data, right? When you register to vote, right, they know how often you vote, right? They know your income level. They know, if you were using Facebook, okay, now they know that if you ever look on Facebook, they actually had to now release this information. You can go in and see what profile they've created of you. And it will literally put in there what they think your political ideology is likely to be. So, there's just a massive amount of data available. They take all of that and they can draw these maps. They can draw them with far more precision than they could in 1990 to create these districts. And I'll show you what that looks like here with the actual state maps and the different proposals that were before our state Supreme Court. So I'll walk you through this, but basically, so don't worry, I know it's overload, don't worry, I'll talk you through it. But in a statewide tie, under our previous map, so before the Supreme Court of the state Supreme Court threw out the gerrymandered maps from prior to 2023, so the latest round of redistricting, under those maps, Democrats in a statewide tie, so if the vote was 50-50, say at the state level, they would only be likely to win 38 out of 99 seats in the assembly. Now, that's far short of a majority, right? And so that's why there was such a baked-in advantage that even with a Democratic governor and a Democratic attorney general and, multiple Democratic statewide offices, the state legislature has been heavily imbalanced, right? They almost had a supermajority, right? The Republicans, where they could have overridden the veto of Evers, and that was only because they almost had 2/3 majorities in both the Assembly and the state Senate, right? Okay, so when we look at what the different proposals that were put before the state Supreme Court, and again, I'm going to walk you through this. That's why I've saved enough time to go through this slide. There's a lot of information on one slide. You can see that there were old submissions, right, that were prior to the maps being thrown out. And so Evers had put forward a least change proposal because he had to abide by the state Supreme Court decision. So it's not the maps he would have preferred, obviously, but it was the maps he put forward. And when you take a look at those, you will see that they were not contiguous, right? So there were pockets of things elsewhere, which ended up being a problem that the state Supreme Court was able to overturn the maps on. You will see that a number of municipalities were split and different wards were split by quite a bit. So it didn't kind of meet some of those criteria that we would have liked to usually have seen. And the projected outcome was 39 for Democrats, 60 for Republicans under the 2022 outcome. And it would have taken the Democrats winning the statewide vote by more than 11 points just to get a majority. That's a pretty tall order in a purple state, right? So basically, it was almost impossible for the Democrats to get an actual majority in the assembly. And that was simply because of how the maps were drawn. It had nothing to do with the actual voting going on amongst them, right? It was how people were packed into the districts for that voting, right? The voting itself was very even statewide, very purple, right? About 50-50. But when you change the districts in such a way, that no longer matters, because really the politicians have already selected who they're going to represent, right? It doesn't really matter if you show up to vote or not. I mean, that's basically the reality, right? The outcome was already baked in because of how the district was drawn. Okay. The GOP legislator had put forward maps that were even more partisan, and you will see that those actually, it would have taken Democrats to get more than 16 points more vote share. So that would look like Democrats getting like 60%, 58 to 60% of the vote, which again is a really tall order when you think about it, pretty evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And then Evers had this People's Map Commission, which you may or may not have heard about, but basically he had some nonpartisan folks look into this and say, well, what kind of maps would you draw? And those looked, not surprisingly, much more balanced, right? They looked much more even between the two parties. Okay, so then the state maps, as you know, I've just said, were thrown out in the December 2023 decision. And that led to a bunch of proposed maps being submitted to the court. And you're probably thinking, well, why did the Republicans accept Governor Evers' map? Well, because a lot of the other maps were very likely going to be thrown out right away, right? The legislative Republicans map was basically the gerrymandered map that previously existed. There was no way the court was going to accept that because they said they wanted more partisan balance, okay? There was a map put in by Will, which is a conservative institute and think tank. That was also very likely to be thrown out, and they knew that. So what do we have left on the table? Well, we have maps put together by some other folks. And if you look, the Evers map is actually less favorable to the Democrats than some of these other maps, right? So they were afraid that if they let the court decide and pick, the court was going to pick a map that was even less favorable than what Evers had put forward, right? So strategically, it made sense for them to just accept what Evers put forward. Because if they had gone with some of these other maps, for example, if you look at the right petitioners of the Law Forward map, you can see that Democrats are projected to win more seats under those maps, right, in the assembly than the Evers map. Now, what did these maps all have in common? They no longer have any of those districts with strange little extra. Now, this often happens because maybe in the areas you live, you know about this, but in cities or townships, sometimes they'll annex things, right? And it's not always contiguous, right? Sometimes there's a separation between what the city, also owns land over in this area that's part of its taxing jurisdiction, whatever. So those maps had some of those elements in it. Now all the maps no longer have that, right? All the maps are contiguous, meaning even those have to now be one full district. You can't have little pockets of stuff outside of your district. You will see that they also have majority-minority districts. And as I had mentioned, usually they're about 5 or 2 in the assembly, 5 for African Americans, 2 for Latinos. And you can see that the maps still preserve those kind of majority-minority districts. When we look at the splits, so look at the Evers map at the top, which I've put the arrow on there, you can see that it actually splits a lot less municipalities than the previous Evers map that was put forward. It also splits a lot less election voting wards, which makes it a lot easier for the election officials, right, to administer those elections. And it also keeps those wards together. So people living next to each other, right, are likely to be in the same district. Okay, so that's the state assembly map. Okay, so now let's look at the state Senate map. And in a statewide tie, under those previous maps, the ones that were thrown out by the state Supreme Court, Democrats were only likely to win 11 out of 33 state Senate seats. Now that's only a third, right? And that's in fact how Republicans got a supermajority, right, in one of the chambers of our state legislature, is because the maps were drawn in such a way that it was exceptionally difficult for Democrats to get a majority in the state Senate. And if you look at these, again, you're going to see numbers not too dissimilar from before, where Democrats under the old maps, they really would have to win, again, more than, say, 15, 16 points. And we're talking, again, running up numbers like close to 60% of the statewide vote for two-party vote share. That's exceptionally difficult in today's political climate, right? We're a battleground for a reason. It's very divided. So it was almost impossible, right, unless there was a massive wave election, right, for Democrats to actually get a majority. And you will see in the old maps, again, that there were contiguity problems. So some of these state Senate districts, just like some of those assembly districts, had little pockets of things outside of the district. So if you think of like a square, right, and then there's like a little circle right outside of that, and again, the Supreme Court rejected that. The state Supreme Court rejected those kinds of districts. So now you'll notice in all the new maps that were submitted, all of them are contiguous, right? And it makes sense again why the Republicans were willing to accept the Evers maps. If you look at the comparison of the Evers map that was put forward along with some of the other petitioners. The legislative Republicans had put forward a map, and it was very clear the Supreme Court was going to reject that, right? Far too partisan and baked in all the advantages that the Republicans had previously enjoyed. And under their map that they had put forward, Republicans were likely to get 23 state Senate seats, and Democrats were likely to get 10. So actually it was even more imbalanced than the previous maps that were already gerrymandered, right? So again, those were likely to be thrown out, as were the Conservative Institute's maps. Now, if you look at this, you'll see that some of these maps were actually much more favorable to Democrats. So Democrats might have actually been better off if the state Supreme Court had selected one of the alternatives to Evers' maps. And I'll give you an example here. So if we look at the Senate Democrats, not surprisingly, given their interest in having a majority in the state Senate, right? The Senate Democrats put forward a map that was actually projected to give the Democrats 18 state Senate seats and the Republicans 15 state Senate seats. Now, if you look at Evers' map, it's very balanced, right? And in fact, the Republicans have a slight advantage by a seat. And so it would have been to the advantage of the Democrats if the state court had picked that map, say, right? Instead of picking the Evers map. And we look at the different splits by districts, you can see that many more municipalities are kept together. So only 33 municipalities were separated under the Evers map in comparison to that least change approach that happened in 2021. You can see that more counties were kept together. And again, a big point here is how far fewer wards were split. And most of the maps were like this too. That's where a lot of those contiguity issues were coming up, was in voting wards, right? Some of these voting wards were not contiguous, and that was what was creating the issues with some of those elements being outside of the district. And so we're under these Evers maps now, and we're not under the old maps, but this is the first election with these Evers maps, right? So what does that mean? Well, the Assembly, just like the House of Representatives, elects all of its representatives, right? Every election cycle. But the state Senate has staggered terms, right? And so it's unlikely that you're going to see a majority for Democrats in the state Senate because of this first election. It will probably take a couple election cycles before the state Senate balances out between the two parties, right? So we're likely to get a much more balanced state Senate in the long run. But the Assembly very well could switch from Republican control to Democratic control. Now, there's no guarantee on that, right? It'll depend a lot on this election outcome. I'm sure you've been seeing how the polling is all over the place, right? And all within the margin of error, too, mostly, right, in Wisconsin. So really it will come out to turnout, right? And it will come out to how some of these individual districts, the candidates that run in those, right? So some of those districts will have very strong candidates, some may not, right? And that could affect the outcome of that race beyond just what the voting patterns are, right? So there'll be some candidate effects, but we do know that at the very least there will be a much more balanced state assembly going forward, right? There were instances in the previous maps where some races had no opposing candidates. And it makes sense, right? If the district is so lopsided, you have no chance of winning, what's the point of running, right? And so really the only competitiveness in that race would happen in the primary, right? For the Republicans that were running. You know, what type of Republican do you want to represent the district? Not whether you want a Republican or a Democrat to represent the district, right? What type of Republican? So it'll become more of, do you want a Republican or a Democrat, right? As opposed to what type of Republican. And that's what we're likely to see in terms of change. Okay, that was a lot of information. So you may have questions. So I'm going to stop there, right, in case we have questions.